Welcome back to the deep dive. Our job here is pretty simple. We take your sources, all that dense research, and we synthesize it into clear, usable knowledge.
And today, we are tackling a big one. A huge one, really.
We're doing a deep dive into personality, a topic that, it feels so personal and we all think we understand it, but it's one of the most complex puzzles in psychology.
It's a total paradox, isn't it? Everyone has an intuitive grasp of what personality is. We call people bubbly or intense or...
Grumpy.
Right, grumpy. But when you try to pin down a scientific definition, one you can actually measure and use to predict behavior, the complexity just explodes.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack that for you. We're going to explore what personality really is in a scientific sense. We'll look at the tools scientists use to measure these elusive patterns.
And then we tackle the big one, the classic question. Nature versus nurture. How much of who we are is baked in from our genetics, and how much is shaped by our environment?
Let's start right at the foundation, the core definition.
Okay, so in psychology, personality describes the relatively, and that's a key word, the relatively stable patterns of behavior, thought, and emotion.
And these patterns make up a person's unique way of adjusting to life.
Exactly.
I want to zero in on that word you highlighted, relatively. Our sources really stress this. It's not static. It's not like you're set in stone at age 5.
No, absolutely not. That stability is what lets us recognize a friend after 10 years. But it's not unchangeable fate. The research is so clear that personality can and does change.
Especially during certain periods, right? Like adolescence.
Adolescence, early adulthood, or after major life experiences. It's like a structure that settles over time, but it's always being modified at the edges.
And this modern idea, this whole science, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. We're sort of standing on the shoulders of giants here.
Oh, definitely. You have to give a nod to the foundational theorists. People like Sigmund Freud, of course.
Right, with the whole intrapsychic structure.
Alfred Adler, Gordon Allport, who really championed individual traits. And then you have the other camps, like Hans Eysenck, or the humanists like Maslow and Carl Rogers.
And that list represents these huge, often clashing schools of thought. I mean, Freud saw us as driven by unconscious conflict.
Kind of destiny, really.
Whereas someone like Rogers had a completely different view, the humanistic perspective, all about free will and striving to be your best self.
And what's so cool is how modern approaches have kind of synthesized all that history. They've organized the study of personality into different domains.
So it's not just one camp versus another anymore.
Not at all. You have dispositional models, so the traits themselves. You have biological models, looking at brain mechanisms, intrapsychic, cognitive experiential. It's a full spectrum investigation now.
That complexity really sets the stage for the challenge of actually trying to measure it. Okay, so let's get into that. If personality is this complex engine, how do scientists actually get under the hood and, measure it with any accuracy?
This is the biggest hurdle. Because personality is so abstract, it's a mix of feelings, thoughts, behaviors. The dimensions you choose to measure can vary a lot from study to study.
And that brings us right to the gold standard of any scientific test. You need reliability and validity.
Always.
Yeah.
You need a test that gives you the same result over and over again. That's reliability. And maybe even more important, you need a test that actually measures what it says it's measuring. That's validity.
Without those two, you're just spitballing, really.
Pretty much. And the sources break the main tools down into two big categories. The first are the objective tests.
These are your standard questionnaires, multiple choice, scales from 1 to 5.
Exactly. They're structured to remove the subjective interpretation of the person giving the test. It's all about quantifiable data. The most famous is probably the MMPI-2.
The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. A mouthful.
It is, but it's a clinical heavyweight. It's massive, and it's used to assess psychopathology. The answers are all compared against these huge statistical norms to make sure the scoring is accurate.
Okay, and on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the projective measures.
Right. This is where you find the famous Rorschach ink blot test.
Tell me what you see in this ink blot.
Exactly. The whole idea is that you're presented with something ambiguous, and in describing it, you unconsciously project your own inner workings, your own personality onto it.
So before the current dominant model, what were the early attempts to sort of map out all these traits?
There were a few big ones. In the 60s, Hans Eysenck tried to simplify things down to just 2 fundamental dimensions.
Yes, I know. Introvert, extrovert.
That's one. And the other was neuroticism, which he saw as a spectrum from emotionally unstable to emotionally stable. It was a really elegant, simple model.
But maybe too simple.
Perhaps. Which brings us to R.B. Kittel, who went in the complete opposite direction. He used a statistical technique called factor analysis and isolated what he believed were 16 fundamental source traits.
16! That's a lot to keep track of.
It led to the 16PF questionnaire, which is still used in clinical settings today for things like therapy planning. But you're right, for general research, it can be a bit unwieldy.
And this tension, this need for a model that's detailed enough, but also simple enough to be practical, is what led the field to a consensus.
Which brings us to the reigning champion, the Big Five inventory. You'll almost always hear it called by its acronym, OCEAN.
Right. And what's so powerful about OCEAN is that it didn't just come from one theorist's grand idea.
No, it emerged from decades of research.
Mhm.
Different scientists using different questionnaires in different languages kept finding that 5 major factors consistently popped out of the data.
And this model is supported by so much evidence. We're talking longitudinal studies, cross-cultural data. The research even suggests that about half of the variation we see in these 5 traits comes down to genetics.
We should probably define the 5 traits just to make sure we're all on the same page. The terms are pretty specific.
Go for it.
Okay, so O is for openness to experience. Think curiosity, imagination, intellectual depth. C is conscientiousness. That's your organization, dependability, goal-directedness.
E is extroversion, sociability, assertiveness, seeking stimulation.
A is for agreeableness. So compassion, cooperation, being trustworthy. And finally, N is for neuroticism, which is the tendency to experience negative emotions like anxiety or anger.
What I find so fascinating about this model is that the real depth is revealed when you look inside each of these 5 factors. They aren't just single traits.
No, they're incredibly complex. Think of it like a set of nested boxes. The big 5 factors are the big outer box, but each of those is made up of smaller components called aspects.
So give us an example.
Okay, let's take openness. It actually splits into 2 aspects: experiencing, which is the aesthetic, imaginative side, and intellect, which is the more cognitive, idea-driven side.
So you could have 2 people who both score high on openness, but one is an artist who loves sensory novelty, and the other is a philosopher who just loves abstract ideas.
Precisely. It explains so much of the variation we see in the real world, and it goes even one level deeper.
To the facets.
Each aspect is made up of even more specific facets. So under the intellect aspect of openness, you find facets for ideas and values. This whole hierarchy is what makes the model so robust.
But you can also go in the other direction, right? You can go higher than the big 5.
You can. When you look at the correlations between the 5 factors, you start to see these higher-order constructs, which we call meta-traits.
And the sources give a great example. Factor beta.
Factor beta is a meta-trait that combines openness and extroversion. It seems to represent this general tendency toward exploration.
Mental exploration, which is the openness part.
In physical exploration, which is the extroversion part, it suggests there's this fundamental underlying drive that governs both of those big 5 traits. It's like a beautiful layered system.
Okay, let's use that framework and apply it to one of the most talked about traits, extroversion. There's this common idea that extroverts are just happier people. Is that scientifically sound?
For the most part, yes. The link is pretty robust. The research consistently shows a positive correlation between extroversion and what psychologists call subjective well-being.
Both in kids and adults.
Both. And what's maybe even more telling is that when you look at individual happiness levels, genetics seems to have a stronger influence than environmental factors.
So there's an inheritable component to your baseline happiness. But that leads to the big question. Why? Why are extroverts generally happier? The sources lay out 2 competing theories.
Right. The first one is the one that just makes intuitive sense. It's called the instrumental theory.
This is the idea that extroverts are happier because they do happier things. They go to parties, they seek out positive social situations, and they react more strongly to those good times.
Their happiness is a direct result of their actions. It's instrumental.
It seems so obvious, but then you look at the research from Lucas and Baird, and it throws a huge wrench in the works.
A giant one. They looked for the evidence, and they found no statistically significant support for the instrumental theory.
That's a huge deal. So extroverts aren't necessarily choosing better situations or reacting more intensely to them.
According to that research, no. The external environment doesn't seem to fully explain that happiness gap.
Which really challenges that whole fake it till you make it idea.
It does. And it leads us to the second and much more supported explanation, the temperamental theory.
Okay, so what does this one propose?
The temperamental theory suggests that it's not about what extroverts do, it's about who they are at a core biological level. They seem to have a disposition, a temperament, that is just naturally tuned to a higher baseline of positive emotion.
So their emotional thermostat is just set a few degrees warmer, basically.
That's a great analogy. And Lucas and Baird found strong support for this. It seems extroverts just experience more positive affect, more positive feeling, regardless of what's happening around them.
Okay, so even if it's temperamental, researchers still look for factors that might explain how that temperament leads to happiness, these mediators.
They found a few. First, there's self-efficacy. That's your belief in your own ability to get things done, to handle situations.
Makes sense. If you believe you're competent, you're probably more outgoing and happier. But it only partially explains the link.
Only partially. Next is self-esteem. Confidence in yourself. Again, no surprise, it's correlated with both extroversion and happiness.
And the third one, which sources suggest is maybe the most powerful, is mood maintenance. I think this is a really interesting concept.
It's crucial. Mood maintenance is your ability to hold on to a positive mood, even when you face something ambiguous or a minor challenge.
So if something happens that isn't clearly a good or bad, how quickly does your good mood evaporate?
Precisely. And the research found that mood maintenance is a much stronger force in extroverts. Their positive moods are more durable, they last longer, and are less easily knocked off course by little bumps in the road.
They have a kind of emotional inertia.
That's it, exactly. But this leads to a really practical question.
Yeah.
If I'm an introvert, can I sort of borrow some of that extroverted behavior? Can I act outgoing and get the mood boost without a downside?
Which brings us to the concept of ego depletion, the cognitive cost of acting against your nature.
There's a great study on this. They had introverts act extroverted talkative, assertive, and they had extroverts act introverted.
And the results for the introverts were actually pretty positive.
They were. When introverts acted extroverted, they experienced an increase in positive affect. They got a mood boost.
But for the extroverts who had to act introverted, it was the opposite.
The complete opposite. They had lower positive affect, and crucially, they suffered from ego depletion.
Let's define that term. It's more than just feeling tired, isn't it?
Much more. It's the cognitive cost of overriding your natural programming. Your brain is using a ton of energy to consciously regulate your behavior, to stop your natural extroverted responses from coming out.
So it's like you're driving with the emergency brake on, you're burning through fuel.
Perfect analogy. And that energy is finite. So after you've spent it all on acting introverted, you have less of it available for other difficult tasks later. You'll struggle more with decision-making, with planning, with regulating other emotions.
That is a massive real-world consequence. It's not that introverts should try to be extroverts all the time, but maybe that pushing yourself for a little while can be rewarding.
Exactly. But forcing an extrovert to act against their nature is literally draining their cognitive resources.
That idea of a core nature, a fundamental internal architecture, is a perfect segue into our next section, the developmental and biological roots of personality. And first, we have to clarify this distinction between temperament and personality.
It's so important because personality isn't perfectly stable over your whole life. It changes really fast in childhood. So researchers use the term temperament for what we see in kids.
And temperament is the precursor, the raw material.
It's the biologically based foundation that later gets shaped by experience and matures into what we call adult personality.
Which leads us straight to the biological models, like the Temperament and Character Inventory, or TCI.
Right. This model suggests 4 basic temperaments that reflect these really automatic, evolutionarily important responses, specifically how we respond to danger and how we respond to reward.
And what are those 4?
They are harm avoidance, reward dependence, novelty seeking, and persistence. And what's interesting is you can kind of see them as modern analogs to the ancient 4 temperaments: melancholic, sanguine, choleric.
Right, but with actual neuroscience behind them now.
Exactly. And the level of detail here is what's so amazing. This is where it becomes hard science. Let's start with harm avoidance.
This is being cautious, worried, easily discouraged.
Behaviorally, yes. And neurologically, it's linked to a supersensitive threat detection system. Specifically, increased reactivity in the insular and amygdala salience networks.
So the brain's alarm system is just hair trigger sensitive.
It is. Biochemically, it's also linked to reduced GABA concentrations.
Yeah.
And this is key.
GABA is the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's the brake pedal.
It's the brake pedal. If you have less GABA, you have less braking power on anxiety and worry. It's a powerful biological reason for that cautious, harm-avoidant temperament.
Okay, now let's flip to the opposite, novelty seeking.
This is your exploratory, impulsive, easily bored type. And biologically, their internal alarm system is much quieter. They have reduced activity in those same insular networks.
So less fear of the unknown.
And crucially, they have increased striatal connectivity. And it correlates directly with their dopamine synthesis capacity.
Dopamine.
Yeah.
The motivation and reward chemical.
Exactly. A higher capacity to synthesize dopamine means their brain is just much more efficient at rewarding the anticipation of new things. It literally drives them to explore.
And there are quick links for the other two as well.
Right. Persistence is linked to brain connectivity involved in goal setting and to the noradrenergic system. And reward dependence, which is about social approval, is linked to the oxytocin system.
The social bonding hormone.
The very same. So it's undeniable that personality starts with our physical hardware. But, and this is a big but, the environment is still incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Personality is more malleable than we used to think.
Which brings us to that classic debate. Parents versus peers. Which one matters more? Let's start with the traditional view, Mary Ainsworth's work.
Ainsworth focused on attachment style, the bond between an infant and their caregiver. She developed this strange situation experiment to observe how kids reacted to being left alone and then reunited with their parent.
And she categorized them into different styles: secure, avoidant, ambivalent.
And disorganized. And the incredible finding was that these early attachment styles were powerful predictors of later behavior. Securely attached kids tended to grow into more trusting, sociable adults.
While disorganized attachment was linked to higher anxiety and risk-taking, so the argument is that the parenting environment is foundational.
That's the argument. But then you have this radical counter theory from Judith Rich Harris.
Her group socialization theory.
Yes. She basically argues that while parents are important in the home, the primary environmental force that shapes your adult personality is your peer group.
Why peers over parents?
Her idea is that this is where you practice for real life. You learn social strategies, you figure out in-group versus out-group behavior. The need to assimilate with your peers, she argues, is more powerful than what your parents teach you at home.
And part of her evidence is that siblings who grow up in the same house can be so different.
Right. The shared family environment seems to have less influence than the unique experiences each child has, often with their separate peer groups outside the home. It's a really challenging idea.
So the final piece of this puzzle is that it's not a one-way street. Your personality doesn't just get shaped by the world, it shapes the world back.
Through two key mechanisms. The first is situation selection.
You choose the situations you enter. An extrovert chooses the party. A conscientious person chooses the library. Simple but profound.
And the second is situation evocation. This is the feedback loop. Your personality-driven behaviors evoke certain responses from others, and those responses reinforce your original behavior.
So if you're agreeable and cooperative, people are friendly back to you, which reinforces your agreeableness.
Exactly. And that feedback loop is what helps lock personality into those relatively stable patterns we talked about at the very beginning.
That idea of evocation, of how our behavior shapes the responses we get, is a perfect bridge to the bigger picture, the cultural and philosophical context.
Because the responses we get are fundamentally shaped by the culture we're living in. And this leads to a massive question in the field. Are personality traits universal, or are they culture-specific?
To get at this, researchers talk about etiquette versus emic traits.
Right. Etiquette traits are the ones believed to be universal, with a biological basis that's common to all humans. Emic traits are the ones that are unique to a specific culture, tied up in local language and customs.
And the evidence really seems to lean toward the Big Five being a universal or etiquette structure.
It does. The sources cite these huge studies, like administering the main personality inventory, the NEO-PIR, across 6 different languages and finding the same 5 factors every time.
And there was another even bigger one.
A massive one. They gave the Big Five inventory in 56 nations, across 28 languages, and while there were some differences, the basic 5-factor structure held up across the world. It suggests a common human foundation.
And the research is quick to point out that even when you see differences, it might not be because the underlying structure is different. It could be a bad translation or biased sampling.
Or even just cultural response styles. Maybe a culture that values humility will score lower on self-reports of extroversion, even if the trait itself is there.
But culture absolutely shapes how those universal traits are valued and expressed.
Oh, massively.
Yeah.
You see this so clearly when you compare Western and Eastern cultures. Western cultures tend to value individualism, assertiveness, traits that align really well with high extroversion.
Whereas many Eastern cultures are more collectivist, prioritizing social harmony and cooperation.
Which means high agreeableness becomes the more socially valued and rewarded trait. The underlying trait is there in both places, but the environmental feedback reinforces different expressions.
It's also wild to realize that our modern idea of having a unique individual personality is, well, it's pretty new, historically speaking.
It is. The sources trace it back to the Renaissance. Before that, in medieval Europe, your identity was mostly your network of social roles, your family, your guild, your village.
So you weren't an individual self so much as you were a node in a social network.
Exactly. And then huge forces like urbanization, mass education, industrialization, they broke down that old system. People's sense of self had to turn inward, and it became this internalized, unique thing we recognize today.
That shift brings us to William James, the great psychologist and philosopher, who made this incredible argument that even when philosophers try to be purely objective, their own temperament is secretly biasing their conclusions.
It's a brilliant insight. Your innate mental makeup is steering your search for truth about the universe.
He actually divided all of philosophy into two camps based on this temperamental split.
He did. On one side, you have the rationalists. James called them tender-minded. They like principles, abstraction, and neat closed systems that explain everything. Think of Spinoza, arguing for a deterministic universe where everything is rationally connected.
And on the other side,
The empiricists. He called them tough-minded. They stick to facts, to what they can sense and observe. They're okay with a messier, more fragmented reality.
and the perfect example of an empiricist defining personality is John Locke.
Absolutely. Locke basically said, forget abstract substances. Personal identity is consciousness. It's that continuous thread of awareness, that feeling of being a self that accompanies your thoughts.
It's the ultimate tough-minded take focus on the experience, not the abstract principle.
And the genius of what James is saying is that whether we're talking about dopamine receptors or the meaning of existence, our own internal wiring is always, always part of the equation.
So we've gone on this huge journey. We started with a simple question: what is personality? And ended up looking at brain chemistry, cultural history, and philosophy.
We really did. We went from the big five and its nested hierarchy of traits all the way down to understanding why the link between extroversion and happiness seems to be more about their built-in emotional stability than the parties they go to.
And we can't forget that concept of ego depletion, the very real cognitive tax you pay when you have to act against your own nature.
We saw how temperament is literally wired into the brain harm, avoidance linked to a lack of GABA, novelty seeking to dopamine capacity, and we wrestled with that debate.
Yeah.
Is it our parents' attachment styles, or, as Judith Rich Harris argued, our peer groups that really shape us?
And finally, we saw how our whole concept of self is a relatively modern invention, and how our temperament might even be biasing our most logical conclusions about the world, just as William James suggested.
And maybe the idea that ties it all together comes from Henry A. Murray. He defined the field of personality as the study of human lives as gross units, as total holistic systems.
So it's not just biology or just experience or just culture. It's everything all at once.
It's the whole person.
So our final thought for you is this: if your personality is this dynamic, biologically grounded, culturally shaped, self-reinforcing system, how does knowing that change the way you look at your own choices, your own motivations, even your own frustrations?
Knowing the ingredients of the self is really the first step toward knowing yourself.
Something to think about. We'll see you next time for the deep dive.